Last week, Yellowstone sent a signal, and the unsettling part is not the signal itself. It is that the scientists who watch this place more closely than almost any volcano on Earth, with the most instruments, the most experience, and the most reason to understand exactly what they are looking at, are still struggling to say what it means. Not because they missed it, they caught it instantly. But because when they looked at what the ground was telling them, it did not fit cleanly into any of the boxes they used to make sense of Yellowstone. And days later, they are still turning it over, still debating it, still unable to give the confident, "This is nothing," answer that everyone wants to hear. Here's the thing most people do not understand about monitoring a supervolcano. The hard part is not detecting the signals. Yellowstone is wired like a patient in intensive care, covered in sensors that catch every tremor, every shift of the ground, every change in the gases and the heat, and they catch all of it, all the time. The hard part is reading them, because the same signal, the same wiggle on a seismograph, the same shift in the ground, can mean completely different things depending on what is causing it deep below, and the causes are hidden from view, miles down, in a system so vast and so complex that even the best scientists in the world are in a real sense reading a language they have only partly learned. And every so often, the ground says something that does not translate cleanly, a sentence with no obvious meaning. And the experts are left doing exactly what the honest ones admit they are doing now, struggling to interpret it. So this is a story about that struggle, about a signal that came out of the ground beneath Yellowstone and did not fit the usual patterns, about why interpreting a supervolcano is so much harder than most people imagine, and about what it actually means when the people whose job is to reassure us instead say, honestly, that they are not yet sure. It is not a story about an eruption, and I want to be clear about that from the start. It is a story about uncertainty, about the limits of what even our best science can know about the giant beneath our feet, and about the strange, humbling position of eavesdropping on something enormous and alive that does not speak our language. Let me take you into the moment the signal appeared, because it is a quieter and stranger scene than you might imagine. There is no dramatic alarm, no red light flashing in a control room. What there is data, streaming in continuously from across the park, into the screens of the scientists who monitor it. And at some point last week, the patterns on those screens began to do something that made the analysts lean in. Perhaps it started with the seismographs, the instruments that record ground shaking, showing a cluster of small earthquakes beginning to register in a particular spot, more of them and closer together. Then the usual background trembling. Perhaps at the same time, the instruments that track the movement of the ground began to show a shift, the slow rise or fall of the surface changing its behavior, speeding up, slowing down, or reversing in a way that broke the recent trend. Perhaps there was a change in one of the other signals too, a flicker in the gases seeping out, a shift in the temperature or output of a thermal feature. Individually, any one of these things happens at Yellowstone all the time and means little. But something about the combination, the timing, the location, the way the pieces did or did not line up, caught the attention of the people watching, and they began to do what scientists do, pulling up the records, comparing this to the past, asking each other what they were seeing. And the uncomfortable answer, the one that has kept them at it for days, was that they were not immediately sure. The signal was real. Its meaning was not. And that gap between knowing that something happened and knowing what it was is the whole story, because it is a gap that no amount of instruments can fully close. You can measure a tremor to 1,000th of a second and a shift in the ground to a fraction of a millimeter, and still be unable to say, with confidence, what the giant 3 miles below actually did to cause it. That is the quiet, humbling truth the analysts were sitting with last week, staring at data that was precise and real and stubbornly unclear. To understand why a signal can be so hard to read, you have to understand that at Yellowstone, there are essentially 3 very different suspects, and they can all leave nearly the same fingerprints. When the ground at Yellowstone shakes, or shifts, or heats, the cause is almost always one of 3 things, and telling them apart is the central challenge of the entire science. The first suspect is tectonic activity, the ordinary faulting of the Earth's crust, the same kind of rock breaking against rock that causes earthquakes all over the world, and Yellowstone sits in a region riddled with faults, so a great deal of its shaking is simply the crust adjusting under regional stresses, entirely unrelated to the volcano itself. The second suspect is hydrothermal activity, the movement of superheated water and steam and gas through the vast plumbing system beneath the park, which can crack rock, shift the ground, and set off swarms of small quakes as pressurized fluids force their way through the crust. Powerful and dramatic but shallow, and not directly about magma at all. And the third suspect, the one everyone fears, is magmatic activity, the actual movement of molten rock deep below, magma or the gases coming off it shouldering through the crust, which is the signal that in a truly serious scenario would precede an eruption. Here's the problem. These 3 very different processes, tectonic, hydrothermal, and magmatic, can produce signals that look remarkably alike on the instruments. A swarm of earthquakes can come from any of the 3. A shift in the ground can come from any of the 3. So when a signal arrives, the scientists are like detectives with a set of fingerprints that could belong to any of 3 suspects, and their entire job is to figure out which one was actually in the room. Using clues that are subtle, ambiguous, and buried miles underground, and figuring out which suspect it was is genuinely, deeply hard for reasons that are worth understanding. The whole drama is happening out of sight, kilometers below the surface, in a system that no one can directly see into. The instruments do not show the magma or the water or the faults themselves. They show the effects, the shaking at the surface, the millimeters of ground movement, the wisps of gas, and from those indirect symptoms the scientists have to reason backward to the hidden cause, like a doctor trying to diagnose a disease from a patient who cannot be opened up, using only the readings on the monitors. And the clues overlap. The depth of the earthquakes is a hint, because magmatic and hydrothermal signals tend to come from certain depth ranges, but the ranges blur into each other. The pattern of the ground movement is a hint, but different causes can produce similar patterns. The chemistry of the gases can help distinguish magmatic from hydrothermal sources, but the readings are noisy and take time to gather. And all of it is happening against a background of constant activity, thousands of little events a year, so that pulling a meaningful signal out of the ordinary noise is itself a challenge. The scientists are, in effect, trying to read the mood of a giant they cannot see, from the faint, ambiguous, overlapping tremors it sends up through miles of rock. And sometimes the giant sends up something that simply does not have a clear signature, a signal that could plausibly be any of the 3 suspects, and there is no immediate way to be sure which. That is not a failure of the science. That is the honest, difficult reality of trying to understand the largest hidden system most of us will ever live near. There are, to be fair, real forensic tells the scientists use to try to name the suspect, and it is worth knowing what they are, because they show both how clever the science is and why it still falls short of certainty. Depth is one of the biggest clues. Very shallow events often point to the hydrothermal system, the water and steam near the surface, while deeper ones can hint at processes closer to the magma, so where exactly the earthquakes originate matters enormously, which is why refining their depth is such a priority. The way a swarm moves is another tell. If the earthquakes migrate over time, stepping steadily in one direction, it can suggest a fluid or a pulse of pressure working its way through the crust. And the speed and direction of that migration can hint at what kind of fluid it is. The character of the shaking itself carries information, because certain kinds of continuous, rhythmic tremor are associated with fluids or gas moving, quite different from the sharp crack of ordinary rock breaking on a fault. And the shape of the ground deformation, mapped in detail, can be modeled to estimate how deep the source of the swelling or sinking lies, and what form it takes, whether it looks more like a spreading sheet of fluid or a deeper, rounder body of magma. Each of these is a genuine, powerful clue. But each is also uncertain on its own, and they do not always agree with each other, so the scientists end up weighing a handful of ambiguous, sometimes conflicting indicators, building a case rather than reading a verdict. When the clues line up, they can speak with confidence. When they do not, which is often, they are left exactly where they are now, holding a set of fingerprints that could belong to more than one suspect. And this particular signal, the one from last week, seems to sit right in that ambiguous zone, which is exactly why the struggle to interpret it has gone on. The reason a signal keeps scientists debating for days is usually that it has features pointing in more than one direction at once. Part of it might look like ordinary tectonic or hydrothermal behavior, the routine grumbling they have seen 1,000 times and know how to dismiss. But part of it might have a characteristic, a depth, a location, a pattern, a pairing of shaking with ground movement that does not quite match the routine explanation, that carries a faint echo of something a little more unusual, and so the interpretation splits. Some read it one way, leaning toward the reassuring, this is just the system doing its usual thing. We have seen this before. Others are more cautious, noting the features that do not fit, arguing that it is worth watching more closely before anyone declares it nothing. Neither camp is being alarmist or dismissive. They are both looking at the same genuinely ambiguous data and weighing it differently, because the data itself does not yet point clearly to one answer. This is what struggling to interpret actually looks like in practice. Not panic, not a cover-up, but careful, experienced people disagreeing in good faith about an ambiguous signal, gathering more data, waiting to see what the ground does next, and refusing, for now, to claim more certainty than they actually have. It is science being honest, which is both reassuring and in its own way. Unsettling, because what it admits is that they do not, at this moment, fully know. Now, before anyone spirals, it is essential to put this in its proper context, because ambiguous signals at Yellowstone are not rare, and they almost never lead anywhere. Yellowstone has been sending up signals like this for as long as we have been listening, and the overwhelming near-total pattern of history is that they resolve into nothing. The ground has swarmed with earthquakes and then gone quiet. It has risen for years and then reversed and sunk back down. Thermal areas have flared up and then settled. Time and again, a signal has appeared that seemed puzzling or even a little concerning. Scientists have watched it closely, and it has faded back into the background, revealed in hindsight as just another expression of a restless but stable system going about its enormous, slow, ordinary life. This has happened over and over. So when a new ambiguous signal appears, the single most likely outcome, by an overwhelming margin, is that it too will fade. that whatever it was, tectonic or hydrothermal or a minor movement of fluids, it will pass without leading to anything, and in a few weeks or months, it will be a footnote in a monitoring report. The base rate is enormously reassuring. Yellowstone produces strange signals constantly, and almost none of them mean anything beyond the fact that it is alive. The struggle to interpret this one is not evidence that this one is different. It is evidence that this one, like so many before it, is ambiguous, and ambiguity at Yellowstone is the normal state of affairs. And this is not a vague claim, because the recent history is full of concrete examples of exactly this playing out. There have been times when the floor of Yellowstone Lake and the areas around it lit up with intense earthquake swarms. Hundreds upon hundreds of quakes striking over a matter of days. A burst of activity that, taken cold, sounds terrifying. Scientists watched them closely, worked to determine whether they were tectonic, hydrothermal, or something more. And in each case, the swarms eventually wound down and the system returned to its background hum. The events understood in hindsight as the crust and the fluids adjusting, not the magma rising. There have been long stretches when the caldera floor rose at an unusually fast pace for years on end, faster uplift than had been measured before, enough to prompt real study and real discussion, and then the ground simply reversed and began to subside again, the episode passing without incident. There have been thermal disturbances in the hottest basins, ground heating up enough to close trails, features changing all at once that alarmed observers and then settled back down. Every one of these was, at the time, a signal that had to be interpreted, that carried some genuine uncertainty that could not be instantly waved away. And every one of them faded. That track record does not guarantee that any particular future signal will be harmless. But it is the single most important piece of context there is, because it shows that puzzling, even dramatic signals are a routine part of Yellowstone's life, and that the honest struggle to interpret them has so far always ended in the same quiet place. And there is a deeper reason that the phrase struggling to interpret should actually reassure you more than it worries you. Once you understand it, it would be far more concerning if the scientists were not struggling, if they had stopped looking carefully, if they waved away every signal without a second thought, or if they claimed a false blanket certainty that nothing could ever be worth attention. The struggle is the sound of the safety system working exactly as it should. It means people are paying close attention, taking every unusual signal seriously enough to argue about it, refusing to be complacent, and holding themselves to honest standards about what they do and do not know. That careful, skeptical, argumentative watchfulness is precisely what you want standing between a hidden giant and the people living around it. And crucially, it is backed by the confidence that if a signal ever did mark the beginning of something serious, it would not be a single ambiguous blip. The awakening of a system this large toward a real eruption would, scientists are confident, announce itself over a long time and through many converging signals, sustained and escalating deformation, swarms growing rather than fading. Gases and heat rising together, a chorus of evidence building over months or years, not one puzzling reading in a single week. So a lone ambiguous signal, even one that resists easy interpretation, sits nowhere near that threshold. The struggle to read it is the system doing careful science on a small, uncertain event, not experts staring at the start of a catastrophe and scratching their heads. The watchfulness is the reassurance. And this is exactly where the gap between the science and the internet becomes a problem, because a signal that scientists are calmly, carefully struggling to interpret is also a signal that the doomsday machine online will seize and distort. Every time Yellowstone so much as twitches, a wave of sensational content follows. Headlines screaming that the supervolcano is waking, that a catastrophe is imminent, that the authorities are hiding the truth, built on exactly the kind of ambiguous signal we're talking about. And the honest scientific answer, we are not yet sure what this means, is tragically easy to twist. Because to a careful scientist, it means we are gathering more data on a probably harmless event. But to a fear-driven headline, it becomes even the experts do not know how bad it is. The very humility that makes the science trustworthy is the thing that gets weaponized to make people afraid. So it is worth saying plainly what the uncertainty does and does not mean. It does not mean the scientists are frightened. It does not mean they are hiding a known danger. It does not mean an eruption is being kept quiet. It means precisely what it says, that a small, ambiguous signal is being studied, that its most likely explanation is routine, and that responsible people are declining to pretend to a certainty they do not have. The internet will always translate that honesty into terror. And understanding the difference between the two is one of the most useful things a person can carry into any Yellowstone story, including this one. But honesty requires acknowledging the other side too, because uncertainty cuts both ways, and that is what gives a signal like this its genuine weight. To say that a signal almost certainly means nothing is not the same as saying it definitely means nothing, and serious scientists do not pretend otherwise. The reason they watch every ambiguous signal so carefully is that, in principle, somewhere in the long future, one of them could be the early, faint, first hint of a change in the system. And the only way to ever catch such a thing would be to take the ambiguous one seriously enough to keep watching. No single signal like last week's is likely to be that, not remotely. But the discipline of the science is to hold the small possibility open, to keep gathering data, to see whether the signal fades as expected, or whether, unusually, it is joined by others. Whether the ground keeps moving, whether the swarm grows, whether the gases shift, whether the ambiguous one becomes the first note of a larger pattern. Almost certainly, it will not. Almost certainly, this fades like all the others. But the reason the scientists are still struggling with it, rather than dismissing it outright, is that they know their job is not to guess and move on. It is to watch, and to withhold judgment until the ground tells them more, precisely because the stakes, in the vanishingly rare case that a signal is ever the real thing, are too high to be casual. The struggle, in other words, is not fear. It is respect for a system whose full language we have not learned, and whose smallest sentences we cannot yet afford to ignore. So what actually happens next with this particular signal? The answer is patient, methodical, and almost anticlimactic, which is exactly how it should be. The scientists keep watching. They continue to collect the earthquake data, refining the locations and depths of the events as more of them are recorded and analyzed, which sharpens the picture of what is happening below. They watch the ground deformation over the following days and weeks, looking to see whether the shift that caught their attention continues, accelerates, reverses, or simply stops. They sample and analyze the gases, which can take time but can help distinguish a magmatic source from a purely hydrothermal one. They compare the evolving signal against the vast archive of past events, searching for the closest historical match. And above all, they wait to see the trend, because a single week is a snapshot, and the meaning of a signal often only becomes clear as it either fades or develops over time. In all likelihood, over the coming days, the swarm will taper off, The ground will settle back into its familiar rhythm, the gases will show nothing unusual, and the ambiguous signal will resolve quietly into the reassuring category of just the system breathing. There will probably be no dramatic announcement, because the absence of a threat rarely makes news. The story will simply end, not with a bang, but with a monitoring report noting that the activity returned to background levels. And the scientists will move on to the next puzzle the ground sends up, as they always do. Stand in the observatory's shoes for a moment, looking at that ambiguous cluster of data from last week, and you can feel the strange position we are all in when it comes to Yellowstone. We have built the finest monitoring system we can, planted our instruments across the restless ground, and taught ourselves to read the tremors and the shifts and the gases as best we can. And still, when the giant beneath speaks, there are times we cannot be sure what it said. Not because we are careless, but because it is that big, that deep, that complex, and that far beyond our full understanding. Last week, it sent a sentence we are still trying to parse, and the most honest thing the experts can say is that they are working on it, that it is probably nothing, that it looks like the kind of thing that fades, but that they are watching because they are not yet certain. That honesty is not a reason to be afraid. It is a reason to respect both the giant and the people watching it. The signal will very likely fade into the long record of Yellowstone's harmless mysteries, one more ambiguous whisper from a system that whispers constantly and erupts almost never. But the fact that we cannot always instantly say what it means is a permanent, humbling reminder of the truth beneath all of this. That we live alongside forces far older and larger than ourselves. That we have learned to listen to them, but not fully to understand them, and that every so often, the ground says something we cannot yet translate, and all we can do is keep listening, carefully, and wait for it to make itself clear. Last week, it spoke. We are still, honestly, trying to understand. And most likely, by the time we do, it will have already fallen silent again, leaving us with nothing but the humbling reminder that the giant is always talking, whether or not we can ever fully understand a word of it.